When my wife Emily and I moved into the old rental house, we thought we had found the perfect place to settle down for a while. It was a quiet neighborhood, the rent was cheap, and it had just enough space for us and our 2-year-old son, Noah. The house itself had a certain charm: high ceilings, creaky wooden floors, and that unmistakable scent of aged wood. Sure, it needed some work, but we liked it. The only thing we weren't too thrilled about was the basement. It was one of those old, unfinished cellars with stone walls and a single, grimy window that was half buried in the ground outside. The landlord told us it was just used for storage, and honestly, that was fine with us. Neither of us had any desire to spend time down there. Noah, however, seemed oddly fixated on the basement door from the start. The first time he pointed at it, we didn't think much of it. Toddlers do weird things all the time. But then he started saying something that made the hair on my arm stand up. Every time he walked past that door, he would stop, point at it with his tiny hand, and say in his soft, matter-of-fact toddler voice, "The man is down there." At first, Emily and I just laughed it off. Kids have imaginary friends, right? We figured he must have picked up something spooky from a TV show, or maybe overheard one of us mentioning the basement. But he never dropped it. Every day, like clockwork, he would stop and point. And the way he said it, so calm, like he wasn't trying to scare us, made it even worse. Then the noises started. It was subtle at first. At night, after we put Noah to bed, I'd be in the living room, watching TV, and I'd hear what I thought was the house settling. Soft creaks, maybe the wind shifting the old boards. But then Emily started hearing it too. Light, rhythmic tapping. Faint, but deliberate. Always coming from the basement. It wasn't loud enough to be alarming, but once you noticed it, it was impossible to ignore. I checked the basement a few times, even stood at the top of the stairs listening. But the second I opened the door, everything went silent. I told myself it was probably pipes or maybe a mouse. Still, we started locking the basement door at night, just in case. One evening, I was taking the trash out to the curb when something made me glance toward the basement window. The glass was old and streaked with dirt, barely letting any light through, but as I walked past, I froze. For a second, just a split second, I thought I saw something in the dimness behind the glass. A face, pale, unmoving, watching. My stomach turned to ice. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the window, barely breathing. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the shape was gone. I told myself it was a trick of the light, that my mind was playing games with me. But deep down, I knew. Someone had been looking back at me. I rushed back inside, locking the door behind me. Emily was in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone, completely unaware that my heart was hammering in my chest. I wanted to tell her what I saw, but how could I? I think I just saw a face in the basement window. Sounded insane, even to me. So instead, I walked into the living room, sat down, and tried to convince myself I was imagining things. Maybe it was my own reflection. Maybe it was a shadow from the porch light. I repeated those explanations in my head like a mantra, but I didn't believe them. And the worst part? I didn't want to check. The thought of opening that basement door and finding nothing, or worse, finding something, made my skin crawl. That night, the tapping got louder. It wasn't the usual soft, distant noise we had been hearing. This time it was deliberate, rhythmic. Knock, knock, knock. Emily sat up in bed, her eyes wide in the dim light. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, barely breathing. It was coming from directly beneath us, the basement. For the first time since moving in, I felt something I hadn't before. Something heavy and suffocating. Fear. Real, primal fear. I threw the blankets off and grabbed the baseball bat I kept by the nightstand. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I crept through the dark house, my pulse thudding in my ears. The basement door stood at the end of the hallway, slightly ajar. That stopped me cold. We always locked it. Always. I gripped the bat tighter, nudging the door open with my foot. The stairs yawned down into pitch blackness, the air thick with a damp, earthy smell. I reached for the light switch and flicked it on. The bulb flickered once, then buzzed to life, casting sickly yellow light over the stone walls. I scanned the room, my breath coming in short, uneven gasps. Nothing. Just old storage boxes and dust-covered shelves. But then my eyes landed on something that made my stomach drop. The small basement window, the one I had seen the face in earlier, was unlocked. I stood there gripping the bat so hard my knuckles turned white. Someone had been in here. Maybe still was. My instincts screamed at me to get the hell out, but I forced myself to step forward, scanning the room for any sign of movement. Then I saw them. Footprints. Bare, wet footprints leading from the window toward the stairs, toward me. I didn't think. I just ran. I spun on my heel, bolting up the stairs 2 at a time, and slammed the basement door shut behind me. My hands shook as I turned the lock, sealing whatever was down there inside. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Emily appeared in the hallway, eyes wide with confusion and fear. "What happened?" she asked, voice hushed but urgent. I couldn't bring myself to say it out loud. That there had been someone, something, down there with me. That the footprints were fresh, wet, like they had just been made. We called the police. When they arrived, I could barely get the words out, my hands still trembling as I explained what I had seen. The officers exchanged glances before one of them cautiously made his way into the basement, flashlight in hand. Emily and I stood in the kitchen, barely breathing, waiting for something, anything. After a few tense minutes, the officer reappeared, shaking his head. "Nobody's down there," he said. "No signs of forced entry either." I opened my mouth to protest, to tell him about the unlocked window, the footprints, but when I led them back down, the prints were gone. The dirt on the basement floor was undisturbed, smooth, as if no one had ever stepped there at all. We didn't sleep that night. Emily held Noah close, and I sat in the dark, gripping the bat, ears straining for any sound. The house felt different now. Like something had shifted, like we weren't alone. By morning, Emily had already made up her mind. "We're leaving," she said, and I didn't argue. We packed our things within hours, loading our car with whatever we could fit. I didn't care about the lease, the deposit, or what the landlord would say. We just needed to get out. A few weeks later, curiosity got the better of me. I searched for any history on the house, anything that might explain what we had experienced. And I found something. A newspaper article from nearly 50 years ago. A man had once lived there, a recluse who rarely left his basement. He had gone missing one winter and was never found. His neighbors reported seeing him through the basement window long after he was gone. I bought this house 3 years ago, a fixer-upper in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Nothing fancy, just a modest 2-story place with a basement that I barely used except for storage. The house was built in the 70s, and it had that old home charm, creaky floors, outdated wallpaper, and a few quirks. I figured I'd get around to fixing eventually. Last weekend, I finally decided to renovate the basement, thinking I'd turn it into a workshop or maybe a home gym. That's when I found it. At first, I thought it was just a loose panel in the basement wall, maybe covering an old wiring job or some plumbing. It was wedged between the concrete foundation and a set of wooden shelves the previous owners had left behind. It didn't match the rest of the wall, slightly recessed, the wood darker, almost like it had been exposed to the elements before being sealed up. I probably wouldn't have noticed it if I hadn't decided to clear out the shelves. Curiosity got the better of me, so I grabbed a crowbar and pried it open. Behind it was a narrow passage, barely wide enough for me to squeeze through. The air that seeped out was stale, thick with the smell of rot and dampness. I had to use my phone's flashlight to see inside. The space wasn't part of the original basement, at least not according to the floor plan I had seen when I bought the house. The walls were rough, unfinished concrete, and the ceiling was low enough that I had to crouch. A few steps in, I noticed something on the ground. A pile of old blankets, crumpled and mildewed, with food cans scattered around them. Some of them were rusted through, their labels faded. That's when I saw the newspapers stacked against the far wall. I picked one up, brushing off the layer of dust. The print was yellowed and brittle, the pages curling at the edges. At first, I thought they were decades old, just some forgotten relic left behind. But then I saw the date, June of last year, only a few months before I moved in. A chill crawled up my spine as I shuffled through the stack. Some were older, from years ago, but the most recent one couldn't have been more than a year old. Someone had been living here, hiding. And if the newest paper was that recent, it meant they might have been here while I was upstairs, completely unaware. I backed out of the crawl space, my heart hammering in my chest. The air in the basement suddenly felt heavier, like the walls were pressing in on me. I told myself it was just an old hideout. Maybe a squatter had used it before the house was sold. Maybe a runaway. It was unsettling, sure, but it didn't mean they were still around. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had disturbed something that should have been left alone. I replaced the panel, stacking the shelves back against the wall, as if that would somehow undo what I had found. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the house settling. I had almost convinced myself that I was overreacting when I heard it. Faint, deliberate shuffling from below. Not the random scurrying of mice or the occasional creak of old pipes, but something rhythmic, slow, pacing. I held my breath, my ears straining. It stopped. A long pause, then a soft, dragging sound, like someone shifting their weight on concrete. I sat up, my skin crawling. The basement door was locked. I had made sure of it. There was no way someone could be down there. But the sound continued, a faint rustling, then silence. My mind raced through the possibilities. Maybe it was just my nerves playing tricks on me. Maybe the air ducts were settling. I reached for my phone, checking the time. 2:17 a.m. Too late to do anything about it, too early to dismiss it entirely. I forced myself to lie back down, telling myself I'd check the basement first thing in the morning. Sleep never came. Every time I started to drift off, I thought I heard something. Tiny movements, the soft scrape of something shifting in the darkness below. I kept picturing that hidden space, the blankets, the food cans. If someone had been living there, had they ever really left? Morning couldn't come fast enough. As soon as the sun was up, I grabbed a flashlight and went straight to the basement. The panel was exactly as I had left it, shelves still pushed up against the wall. No signs of disturbance. For a second, I felt ridiculous. Maybe I really had imagined the sounds. Maybe my mind had just latched onto the unease of finding that hidden space and turned it into paranoia. Still, I had to be sure. I moved the shelves aside, pried open the panel, and aimed my flashlight inside. The blankets were still there, the food cans, the stack of newspapers. But something was different. The dust on the floor had been disturbed. I could see faint marks, like someone had dragged their fingers through it. And then I saw something that hadn't been there before. A tin can rolling slowly on its side, as if it had just been nudged. The air in that crawl space felt charged, heavy with something I couldn't name. A deep, crawling instinct told me to seal it back up and forget I ever found it. But I had to know. I took a step inside, scanning the cramped space. No footprints, no signs of anyone actually living there now. Just that overwhelming sense of being watched. My flashlight caught something scratched into the concrete near the blankets, Small, uneven letters, like they had been carved with a dull knife or a rock. 3 words. He still lives. My stomach turned. I didn't know what it meant, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I scrambled out of the crawl space, shoved the panel back into place, and pushed the shelves against it harder than before. My hands were shaking. Whoever had been down there, maybe they never really left. Or maybe they were planning to come back. I spent the rest of the day trying to convince myself there was a logical explanation. Maybe the scratches were old. Maybe I just hadn't noticed them before. But no matter how I spun it, I couldn't ignore the feeling that I wasn't alone in that house. By nightfall, I had every light on, the basement door locked tight, and a knife on my nightstand. Just in case. I barely slept. Every noise set me on edge. Around 3 a.m., just as I was beginning to doze off, I heard it again. The same slow, deliberate shuffling, but this time it wasn't coming from below. It was closer, above me. My breath hitched as I realized the sound was coming from the attic. I lay frozen, my heart hammering in my chest. If someone had been hiding down there, what if they had moved? I grabbed my phone and called the cops, whispering as I told them someone might be in my house. They arrived within minutes, searching every inch. Basement, attic, closets. Nothing. The panel was still sealed. The attic was empty. No forced entry anywhere. One of the officers gave me a look like I was wasting their time, but another, the older one, pulled me aside. "You're not the first owner to call about strange noises here," he muttered, almost like he wasn't supposed to say it. "Previous guy claimed he saw someone in the basement once, but by the time we arrived, no sign of forced entry." House was empty. That was all I needed to hear. I spent the next morning packing. By the end of the week, I had moved out and put the house up for sale. I never went back. I don't know who or what was living in that hidden space. I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, I think about those words scratched into the concrete. He still lives. Where? I don't care. As long as it's not with me. When I moved into this house, I wasn't expecting much. It was an old rental, nothing fancy, just something to get me through the next year while I figured things out. I had just gotten out of a long-term relationship and needed a fresh start, somewhere quiet, away from the city. The house was a bit creaky with outdated fixtures and uneven floors, but it had charm. More importantly, it was cheap. The only real issue was the attic. It had one of those pull-down doors with a ladder right in the hallway outside my bedroom. I barely thought about it at first. I had no reason to go up there. That is, until my dog Murphy started acting strange. Murphy is the most easygoing dog I've ever had. Friendly, playful, not easily spooked. But from the first night in that house, he refused to go near the attic door. The first time I noticed, he was standing frozen in the hallway, staring up at it, his tail low, ears pinned back. I laughed it off, figuring he just needed time to adjust to the new place. But it kept happening. Sometimes he'd let out a low, uncertain whine, or he'd refuse to walk past it altogether, forcing me to tug him along. I even caught him growling at it once, barely audible, the kind of growl dogs do when they're not sure if they should be scared or not. At first I told myself it was just a draft. Old houses settle, air shifts. Doors move on their own all the time, right? But after the third or fourth morning of waking up to find the attic door cracked open, I started to feel uneasy. I knew for a fact I hadn't touched it. I never even pulled the ladder down. The first time I noticed it, I assumed maybe I hadn't closed it properly when I last checked if it was locked. But by the fourth time, I was sure. Something was off. Finally, I decided to put my paranoia to rest. One afternoon, while the sun was still high and every rational part of me felt silly, I pulled the ladder down and climbed up. The attic smelled stale, like dust and forgotten things. A single light bulb hung from a cord, barely illuminating the space. There wasn't much up there, just insulation, a few wooden beams, and, in the farthest corner, a sleeping bag and an old, half-empty water bottle. My stomach twisted at the sight of them. Someone had been up here. Recently. I stood there for a long time, just staring at the sleeping bag, my pulse pounding in my ears. I told myself it had to be from a previous tenant. Maybe they left it behind when they moved out. But the water bottle, that was different. It wasn't covered in dust like everything else. I crouched down, hesitated, then picked it up. The plastic crinkled under my fingers, and when I tilted it, a few drops of water sloshed inside. Someone had used this recently. My stomach tightened. The idea that a stranger had been up here while I slept, while I went about my days downstairs, made my skin crawl. I climbed back down the ladder faster than I should have, nearly missing a step. Murphy was waiting for me at the bottom, ears perked, tail stiff. I shut the attic door and locked it, double-checking the latch before stepping back. My hands were shaking, but I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it had been there for weeks, months even. I didn't want to let my imagination run wild. That night I went to bed early, determined to put it out of my mind. But as I lay in the dark, listening to Murphy breathing at the foot of my bed, my mind wouldn't stop spinning. Then, sometime past midnight, I heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps above me. I froze. My breath hitched in my throat, every muscle in my body locking up. The sound wasn't the random creaks of an old house settling. It was movement. Slow, cautious steps, like someone was trying not to be heard. My brain scrambled for explanations. An animal? A raccoon, maybe? But the weight, it was too steady, too human. Murphy lifted his head, his ears twitching. A low, warning growl rumbled in his chest, and that was all the confirmation I needed. Someone was up there. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, my fingers fumbling with the screen. My first instinct was to call 911, but then I hesitated. What was I supposed to say? That I thought someone was in my attic because my dog was growling? That I heard footsteps? What if it really was just an animal? I didn't want to look ridiculous. Instead, I grabbed the flashlight I kept by my bed, my heart hammering as I slid out from under the covers. Murphy stood up, alert, his eyes locked on the ceiling. The footsteps had stopped. The silence was worse. I crept toward the hallway, every step feeling like I was walking through quicksand. The attic door was still latched, exactly as I'd left it. But that didn't mean whoever, or whatever, was up. There wasn't listening, waiting. My hand hovered over the latch, my breath shallow. I considered yanking the ladder down and confronting whoever was inside, but the thought of seeing someone crouched in the dark attic, looking down at me, made my stomach turn. Instead, I grabbed one of the dining chairs, wedged it under the attic door handle, and backed away. I barely slept that night. Every tiny noise made me flinch. Every shift in the house sent my pulse racing. Murphy stayed close, his body pressed against my side. By morning, I had convinced myself that I was being paranoid. But when I stepped into the hallway, my blood ran cold. The chair I had wedged under the attic door was lying on its side. The door was cracked open just an inch. That was it. I wasn't staying in that house another night. I called my landlord, told him the attic door wouldn't stay shut. Told him I heard noises, that something felt wrong. He was surprisingly calm about it. Too calm. "Yeah," he said after a long pause. "The last tenant mentioned something like that too." My stomach flipped. He never said why they left so suddenly. I didn't ask. I packed my things and was gone by the afternoon. I never went back. When my wife, Claire, and I bought our house, we knew it was going to be a project. It was one of those old fixer-uppers that had been sitting on the market forever, the kind that people walked into and immediately walked back out of. But we saw potential. It had charm. Original hardwood floors, antique fixtures, and a basement big enough to be turned into something useful. We figured a little hard work, and some elbow grease would make it ours. The first couple of weeks were all about cleaning, tearing out old wallpaper and fixing up the wiring. It wasn't until we got to the basement that things took a turn. The basement was worse than we expected. Damp air clung to the walls, and the whole place smelled like rotting wood. Most of it was just clutter, old furniture covered in dust, stacks of yellowed newspapers, and rusted tools that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. But then we saw it. Against the far wall, half hidden behind a pile of wooden crates, was a door. It was different from the others in the house, older, rougher, thick wooden planks hammered shut with long rusted nails, as if someone really didn't want it to be opened. Claire and I exchanged a glance. It didn't make sense. Why would someone board up a door inside their own basement? At first we figured it was just an old storage closet. Maybe the previous owners had sealed it off because of mold, or maybe it led to some kind of crawl space. But the more we looked at it, the stranger it felt. The wood was warped, cracked in places, but the nails were deep, rusted like they'd been there for decades. It gave me a weird feeling, like we weren't supposed to mess with it. But Claire, always the braver one, shrugged and grabbed a crowbar. "Might as well see what's inside, right?" she said, prying the first nail loose. The sound it made, a long, groaning creak, sent a shiver down my spine. It took longer than we expected to get the door open. The nails resisted, almost as if they didn't want to come out. But eventually, with enough effort, the last one gave, and the door swung inward. A gust of stale air rushed past us, carrying a scent that made my stomach turn, something between damp earth and old sweat. The room beyond was small, no bigger than a walk-in closet. No windows, no shelves. Just a single wooden chair in the dead center of the room, and the walls. They were covered in scratches, deep, uneven gouges, like someone had clawed at them over and over again. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The sight of that empty chair, sitting in the center like it was waiting for someone, sent a sick feeling through my stomach. The scratch marks on the walls were deep, some overlapping, some carving into the wooden beams like desperate, panicked writing. I stepped forward, running my fingers over one of the grooves. It was jagged, uneven, as if made by human nails. Claire stood beside me, arms crossed, staring at the chair like it might move on its own. "What the hell is this?" she muttered. I had no answer. The whole thing felt wrong. I don't know how else to describe it. Like we'd opened something we shouldn't have. The air was heavy, stale, carrying an old, lingering dampness that clung to my skin. The longer I stood there, the more uncomfortable I felt. Something about that room made my skin crawl. Maybe it was some kind of storage space, I offered weakly, but I didn't believe it. There were no shelves, no remnants of boxes or furniture. Nothing except that damn chair. Claire moved past me and crouched down, running her fingers over the scratches on the floor. They were deeper than the ones on the walls, long, erratic streaks leading toward the door, as if something had been dragged back inside. I tried to shake off the unease. "Let's just close it back up," I said. "Forget we found it." But Claire wasn't listening. She stood up, brushing dust from her jeans, her expression shifting from discomfort to determination. "No way! This is part of the house. We should at least figure out what this was." She pulled out her phone and snapped a picture of the room. I flinched at the flash. It felt wrong to photograph it, like it was disrespecting something old and forgotten. The second the light illuminated the space, I swore I saw something, just for a fraction of a second. A shadow low to the ground in the corner of the room. By the time I blinked, it was gone. I forced a laugh, but it came out shaky. "We should just..." Before I could finish, there was a sound. A sharp, dragging scrape against the far wall. We both froze. It was faint, barely there, but unmistakable. Something inside that room had moved. I turned to Claire, expecting her to look just as freaked out as I felt, but she was staring at her phone screen, face pale. "What is it?" I asked. She swallowed hard, flipped the phone around and showed me the picture she had just taken. The room looked the same, except now, standing behind the chair, there was a figure. My breath caught in my throat. The figure in the photo was barely visible, just a dark silhouette, standing behind the chair like it had always been there. No features, no details, just a shape, wrong in a way I couldn't explain. Claire swiped at the screen, zooming in, but the closer we looked, the more distorted it became. The pixels blurred like the image itself was trying to erase whatever was there. My hands were clammy. That wasn't there," I muttered, though saying it out loud didn't make me believe it anymore. I glanced back at the room, half expecting to see something standing there. But it was empty. Just the chair, just the scratches, just the awful, suffocating silence. Claire stepped back, gripping her phone like it might jump out of her hands. "Maybe it's a trick of the light," she said, but I could hear the doubt in her voice. We both knew the basement was dim, but not dim enough to create that. The weight in my chest only got heavier. The air in the small room was shifting, thickening. That wrong feeling from before, the one I'd been trying to ignore, had only grown stronger, like we were being watched. "We should go," I said, and this time Claire didn't argue. We left the basement in a hurry, practically running up the creaky wooden stairs. The moment I stepped into the kitchen, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I told myself it was fine, that we had just freaked ourselves out over an old, creepy room. But my nerves wouldn't settle. Claire was still looking at her phone, scrolling through the picture, her fingers tense. "I think I should delete it," she murmured. I nodded. I didn't want that thing saved anywhere. She hesitated, then tapped the screen. The photo disappeared, and then, from downstairs, we heard it. A sound. Faint, but unmistakable. A creak, slow and deliberate, like weight shifting against old wooden floorboards. It came from the basement. Claire's eyes locked onto mine. "The chair," she whispered. "It moved." Neither of us wanted to go back down there, but we couldn't just ignore it either. If we left that door open, if we left whatever was down there unchecked, I don't know. It felt like an invitation, like it would spread. Claire grabbed my arm before I could take a step. "Wait," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "What if we just leave it? Nail it back up, forget it ever happened?" I wanted to agree. God, I wanted to. But deep down, I knew that wasn't an option. We had already let it out. I swallowed hard and forced myself to move. Every step down the basement stairs felt heavier than the last, like the air itself was pushing against me. Claire followed, gripping the railing with white-knuckled fingers. When we reached the bottom, I stopped. The door to the small room was still open. But the chair was facing the doorway. It had been in the center before, turned toward the wall. Now it was angled toward us, as if something had been sitting there waiting. The scratches on the floor seemed deeper than before, fresher somehow, like they had been carved in recently. My mouth went dry. Neither of us spoke. We just stood there, frozen, listening. The house was silent, but it wasn't empty. I could feel it. That thick, oppressive presence pressing in on us from all sides. I reached for the door, my fingers trembling, and slammed it shut. Claire didn't hesitate. She grabbed the hammer we had used earlier and started nailing it back up, her movements frantic, desperate. I helped her, working faster than I thought possible, sealing it shut as best we could. When the last nail was in, we stepped back, breathing hard. The air in the basement was still heavy, but the wrongness, the watching, seemed to ease, just a little. We never went back down there after that. Not really. We finished the rest of the renovations, but the basement stayed untouched. Every now and then, I catch Claire looking at the door, like she's expecting to hear something from the other side. And sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and I'm lying awake in bed, I swear I hear it too. That slow, deliberate creak of wood shifting against the floorboards. Like something is still sitting in that chair, waiting. I moved into the basement apartment of a shared house last September. It wasn't much, just a small space with a kitchenette, a tiny bathroom, and a single window that barely let in any sunlight. But the rent was cheap, and at the time, that was all that mattered. My landlord, Mr. Callahan, was an older guy who lived upstairs and mostly kept to himself. When he handed me the keys, he mentioned something offhandedly. "No one's lived down here for a long time." I didn't think much of it. The place was a little musty, sure, but nothing a few open windows and air fresheners couldn't fix. I was just relieved to finally have a place of my own. The first few nights were uneventful. I spent most of my time unpacking, setting up my tiny living space, and getting used to the occasional creaks and groans of an old house. At first, I blamed the strange noises on the building settling. The occasional creaking floorboard, the distant hum of the pipes, nothing out of the ordinary. But then I started hearing something else. At night, when everything was quiet, I'd hear soft footsteps coming from behind the walls. Faint, deliberate, like someone walking barefoot just out of sight. I tried telling myself it was just the house, maybe rodents in the walls. But deep down, something felt off. One night I woke up suddenly, heart pounding. At first I didn't know why. I wasn't having a nightmare, and there was no loud noise to jolt me awake. But then I heard it. A door clicking shut. The sound was so clear, so close, that I instinctively turned toward my bedroom door. It was closed just as I had left it. The only other door in the apartment was the front door, and it was locked. I lay there frozen, my ears straining in the silence. The sound hadn't come from either of those. It had come from somewhere inside the basement. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, slowly scanning the small space. Nothing was out of place. But when I moved toward the corner near the bathroom, an overwhelming sense of unease crawled up my spine. I didn't see anything unusual, but I knew the sound had come from that direction. I hesitated, then reached out, running my fingers along the wall. Solid. No door, no hidden panel, just drywall and old paint. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that somewhere, something had shifted. I barely slept that night. Every tiny noise made my skin crawl. The soft creak of the floorboards upstairs, the faint hum of the refrigerator, it all felt amplified in the silence. By morning, I had convinced myself I was overreacting. Maybe I had dreamt the sound of the door. Maybe my mind was just playing tricks on me because I was still getting used to living alone. But later that evening, as I was brushing my teeth, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The small rug in the bathroom, the one I always kept perfectly aligned with the sink, was slightly askew. It was such a small detail, so insignificant, yet it filled me with an immediate gut-wrenching dread. Because I knew I hadn't moved it. That night, I set up my phone to record while I slept. I didn't expect to catch anything. I just wanted proof that I was imagining things, that there was nothing unusual happening. When I checked the recording in the morning, most of it was just static silence. But around 3:12 a.m. there was a noise. A soft shuffling, like bare feet dragging across the floor. Then a faint creak, followed by a sound I couldn't immediately place. I rewound and listened again. It was a soft click. The same click I had heard the night before. The sound of a door shutting. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was wrong with that basement. I went upstairs and asked Mr. Wyatt Callahan if the house had any weird history, trying to sound casual. At first he just shrugged and said he didn't know much. He'd owned the place for about 10 years. But when I pressed him, something changed in his expression. A slight hesitation, a flicker of discomfort. He sighed and finally admitted, "There was a tenant before you. Years ago, a guy named Daniel. He lived in the basement, just like you. Then, one day, he disappeared." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Disappeared?" I repeated. Mr. Callahan nodded. "He just vanished, left everything behind. Cops looked into it, but there wasn't much to go on. No signs of a break-in, no evidence of foul play. It was like he walked out one day and never came back. His stuff's still in storage somewhere. I never knew what to do with it." I couldn't shake the unease that settled over me after that conversation. That night, as I lay in bed, every creak and whisper of the house felt more sinister. I kept my phone clutched in my hand, ready to hit record at the slightest sound. But nothing happened. No footsteps, no clicks, no movement. Just silence. And somehow, that was worse. I barely slept, my mind racing with the thought of Daniel, of what might have happened to him, of whether he had heard the same noises I was hearing now. The next morning, I made a decision. If Daniel had left everything behind, I wanted to see what was in that storage. Mr. Callahan was reluctant at first, but eventually he led me to a small, locked room at the back of the basement. One I had never paid much attention to. Inside, dust-covered boxes and old furniture sat undisturbed, like a snapshot of another life frozen in time. I rifled through the belongings, my hands shaking. Clothes, books, an old cassette player. But at the bottom of one of the boxes I found something that made my blood run cold. A notebook. The last page was dated just days before Daniel disappeared. I flipped through the entries, my pulse quickening with every word. At first, it was just normal stuff. Work complaints, notes about the weather. But then, the tone shifted. I keep hearing footsteps behind the walls. There's a door here that doesn't exist. Last night I woke up to the sound of breathing in my room. The final entry was scrawled in frantic, uneven handwriting. I saw it. It came through the wall. That was it. No explanation, no details. Just those chilling words. I left that basement the next day, packed up and moved out without looking back. Mr. Callahan didn't argue. Maybe he knew better than to try to convince me to stay. I don't know what happened to Daniel, and I don't think I ever want to. But sometimes late at night I still think about that door. The one I heard but never found. And I wonder, was Daniel the only one who disappeared? Or was he just the first? I was 16 the summer my parents decided to host a community yard sale in our backyard. It was my mom's idea. She had been on this decluttering kick ever since we moved into the house 2 years ago. We had boxes of old toys, books, clothes, even a few pieces of furniture that had been gathering dust in the basement. My dad set up folding tables while my mom arranged everything neatly, taping price tags on every item. The whole neighborhood was invited, and plenty of people stopped by, some familiar faces, others complete strangers. I was in charge of the cash box, sitting in a lawn chair under a big striped umbrella, watching as people haggled over things we barely remembered owning. That's when I noticed him. He was older than my parents, maybe mid-50s, with thin gray hair and a face that looked like it had seen too much sun. He wore a plain brown jacket despite the heat, and had this slow, deliberate way of moving, like he was in no rush to be anywhere. At first he blended in with the other shoppers, picking up random things and putting them back down. But he wasn't really looking at the items. He was looking at the house. I caught him glancing up at the second-floor windows, his eyes flicking toward the side gate, then back to the crowd. When he finally did speak, It wasn't about the sale. "How long have you lived here?" he asked my mom. She answered politely, but I could tell she was a little thrown off. "Nice place," he muttered, before asking something even weirder. "Does the basement have a separate entrance?" That question set off an uneasy feeling in my stomach. My mom hesitated before answering, just long enough for me to notice. "No," she said, which was a lie. There was an old basement door around the back, but it was rarely used. The man nodded like he already knew. Then, without buying anything, he turned and walked away, disappearing down the street. I thought that was the last we'd see of him. I was wrong. That night, I was lying in bed, scrolling on my phone, when I heard a sound outside my window, a soft rustling, like someone shifting through leaves. Our house had a big tree out front, but there was no wind. I sat up, heart pounding, and peeked through the blinds. My breath caught in my throat. There, standing on the sidewalk, was the man from the yard sale. He wasn't moving. He wasn't even pretending to walk past. He was just staring at the house, at my window, like he was waiting for something. I ducked down before he could see me, my hands shaking as I reached for my phone. But when I looked again, he was gone. The next morning, I told my parents about what I saw. My dad shrugged it off, saying the guy was probably just passing by, and my mom reminded me that plenty of people walked through our neighborhood. But I knew what I saw. He wasn't passing by. He was watching. Still, without any proof, I let it go, telling myself I had overreacted. But then, the little things started happening. First, I noticed the side gate was left open, swinging slightly in the breeze. My dad was meticulous about keeping it shut, and I knew for a fact it had been closed the night before. Then, 2 days later, I found a cigarette butt near the basement window. No one in my family smoked. It was damp, like it had been sitting there for a while, but it hadn't been there before. By the time I found the footprint, I knew I wasn't imagining things. It was a single muddy print near the back door, half smudged, like someone had stepped in the dirt and then hesitated before moving. I stood there staring at it, my skin crawling. I thought about telling my parents again, but what would I say? That I had a bad feeling? That someone might be sneaking around our house at night? I knew they'd tell me I was being paranoid. So instead, I kept my eyes open. Every night, I checked the locks twice, made sure the curtains were drawn, listened for any sound outside my window. And for a few days, nothing happened. Then, one night, the motion sensor light turned on. I was in bed, half asleep, when the bright glow leaked through my curtains. At first, I thought it was just an animal. Sometimes raccoons triggered it, but something made me get up anyway. I walked to the window and peeked out, heart hammering in my chest. And that's when I saw him. He was standing at the basement entrance, half hidden in the shadows. His back was hunched slightly, his head tilted up, like he was listening. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I just stood there, frozen, watching as he took a step forward, then another. And then, just as suddenly as he appeared, he was gone. 1 second he was there, the next, he slipped into the darkness, disappearing before I could even think to scream. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the house made my skin prickle. Every gust of wind against the windows made my stomach clench. I wanted to wake my parents, to tell them I had seen him again, but I knew how it would go. They'd check, find nothing, and tell me to go back to sleep. I needed proof. So the next morning, after they left for work, I went outside to check. The ground near the basement door was still damp from the night before, and sure enough, there were footprints. Not fresh, but not old either. Just deep enough in the mud to show someone had been standing there for a while. And near the steps, something even worse. A handprint. It was faint, smeared across the side of the house, like someone had pressed their palm there for balance. I snapped a photo and debated what to do next. Calling the cops felt extreme. What would I even say? Hey, an old guy from a yard sale might be creeping around my house at night? But deep down, I knew this wasn't normal. That man hadn't just been curious about the house, he had been studying it. And now he was coming back. That night I convinced my dad to double-check the locks, using the excuse that I had seen a stray dog near the yard. He didn't ask questions, just flipped the deadbolts and secured the side gate. But even with everything locked up tight, I still lay awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something to happen. It happened around 2 a.m. I woke up to a noise, a soft, deliberate tap, tap, tap against the glass. My stomach flipped. The window. My window. I turned my head slowly, barely breathing, and saw it. A shape in the dark, just beyond the glass. He was standing outside, barely visible in the faint glow of the streetlights, his face just inches from the window. I couldn't see his eyes, but I could feel them. Watching. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My throat locked up, my limbs frozen in place. I wanted to run to wake my parents, but I was paralyzed, trapped in some nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. And then, he moved. Slowly, one hand raised, fingers curling against the window pane like he was testing it, seeing if it would open. That broke the spell. I shot out of bed and stumbled back, my foot catching on the edge of the rug. I crashed to the floor, and in that instant, the spell was broken. I scrambled up, grabbed my phone, and hit the emergency dial. But when I looked back at the window, he was gone. The police arrived within 10 minutes, but by then, the man was long gone. I was shaking too hard to explain things properly, but I showed them the footprints near the basement, the handprint on the wall, and the photo I had taken earlier. One of the officers shined his flashlight along the fence line, looking for any sign of forced entry, but there was nothing. No broken locks, no cut screens, no evidence that anyone had been inside. Still, they took my statement and promised to patrol the neighborhood for the next few nights. My parents, now fully awake and alarmed, finally took me seriously. My dad even installed extra locks on the doors the very next morning. For a few days, things were quiet. I kept expecting to see him again, to wake up to that awful tapping at my window, to catch a glimpse of his shadow lingering in the yard. But he never came back, at least not that I know of. Maybe the police scared him off, or maybe he had been testing our security, waiting for the right moment, and realized we were being too cautious now. I don't know, and that's the worst part. Not knowing. A week later, my mom found something strange while cleaning up the basement. In the farthest corner, wedged behind an old shelving unit, there was a small pile of cigarette butts. The same brand as the one I had found outside. My stomach turned to ice. Whoever had been sneaking around our house hadn't just been watching from the outside. At some point, they had been inside. The realization made me sick. We changed the locks the same day. It's been years since it happened, but I still think about it sometimes. About the way he stood there, silent, just watching. About the questions he asked at the yard sale, like he had been planning something from the very start. We never saw him again. But even now, every so often, I wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, convinced that I heard something outside my window. And every time, I have to force myself to check, just to make sure no one is standing there.